This is the second lecture for Wednesday, April 15th. We're talking about ecosystem ecology, and we're talking about energy flow through ecosystems. So for this topic, we're going to look at two different features of energy flow through ecosystems. A lot of this is going to be about the quantity of energy that's first produced by photosynthetic organisms and how that energy flows through ecosystems and how that level of energy is a huge determining factor on how diverse communities are, how productive communities are. It all starts with photosynthesis and primary productivity. But first, in order to understand how energy moves through ecosystems, it will be useful to look at how you can quantify the amount of energy. Now, if somebody said to you, go across the street there, let's say we were on campus, you're going to go across the street there to that forest, and you're going to quantify energy. You're going to quantify primary productivity. Well, then there's different ways that you can look at energy. You can quantify energy. It's not like you have an energy meter where you can go and measure it. So let's look at that first of all. How is energy expressed in ecosystems? Well, there's a number of different ways. There's a number of different units that are used to measure energy. Now, if you're familiar with the amount of energy that's in different foods, and you look at every food label has the number of calories. So calories is a unit of energy, but the international unit of energy is joules. So that's another rate. But let's stick with calories. Calories is a unit of energy. There's a certain amount of energy in a certain amount of food. So there's an energy density. You could look at the same thing in terms of an ecosystem. There's a certain amount of energy in terms of calories per square meter, and it's not, if it doesn't make much sense unless you're looking at the rate of energy production, in which case there would be some time unit like energy per year. So that's what is used as an expression of quantifying energy production in different ecosystems. And in fact, whether you're talking about the kilocalories per square meter per year or joules per square meter per year, it's basically how much energy is converted from sunlight to chemical energy stored in these photosynthetic organisms. So it's productivity in terms of that conversion of sunlight to chemical energy, that fixing of carbon, taking carbon out of the atmosphere, out of the water, and joining it together to form sugars. That is primary productivity. And as we'll see, that's what sets the stage for everything else in an ecosystem. If there's a lot of primary productivity, there's a lot of energy available for everything in that ecosystem. If there's not very much primary productivity, we've looked at different reasons for productivity being affected, sunlight and rainfall, for instance, depth, if you're talking about the water. If there's not very much primary productivity, there's not very much energy, you're not going to have a very diverse community, you're not going to have a very productive ecosystem, obviously. So let's focus on this idea of primary production, this fixing of carbon out of the atmosphere, out of the water. This is what photosynthetic organisms do. And converting those carbons that are there into some organic form, some form of energy that can be used by organisms. It can be burned in cells to produce ATP. That's what primary producers do. So if you go all the way back to your introductory biology days, courses, which For some of you, it was a while ago, but for others, not so long. And you think about this equation that summarizes photosynthesis. That's this equation here that says 6 carbon dioxide, 6 water. So plants are taking carbon dioxide out of the air, out of the water, and they're combining that with water, and they're making sugar, C6H12O6, that's glucose, and another byproduct of that reaction of photosynthesis is oxygen. So those are very good things for consumers like us, that you're taking carbon, making sugar, which can be eaten by us, making oxygen, which we need to breathe. So you can see the carbons that are highlighted here in blue. There's carbon and carbon dioxide. This is what carbon fixation is, taking carbon and fixing it into sugar. That's what takes place in photosynthesis. Now, it's a lot more complex than that. And these plants and photosynthetic organisms, they're actually using light energy to make ATP and using ATP to carry out these reactions of joining carbons together. But in the end, you've got carbon assimilated. You've got carbon that represents some kind of energy, first that the plant can use, and then that things that eat the plant can use for energy. So that's primary production. And you've got a number of different ways of looking at primary production. There's the total amount of energy that's stored in plants. Now, a lot of this energy, as we saw, is going to be used by the plants. The plants aren't doing this because they're really nice and they're thinking, I'm going to make a bunch of sugar and I'm going to let everything eat me, to have this role in ecosystems, to be the primary producer. No, they're making this sugar to use for their own selfish purposes. So the total amount of primary production is gross primary production. That's what is generated, or the amount of carbon that's fixed by plants or algae, photosynthetic organisms. Now, we saw that a lot of that is unavailable for whatever is going to eat this phytoplankton or plants. A lot of that energy is lost. A lot of that energy is used by the plants. That's why they're doing this in the first place. So what's available to be eaten and passed on to the next trophic level, passed on to consumers, is a fraction of that gross primary production, and it's net primary production. And another way that you can look at this is that these plants, they fix carbon and they store sugar. They have a certain amount of energy. They use some of that energy in respiration for their own cellular respiration, their own energetic demands. Plants need energy to live. So another way of looking at this, the relationship between gross primary production and net primary production, is if you subtracted net primary production from gross primary production, the difference is what the plants are using for their own energy needs, basically respiration, cellular respiration in plants. So if you're looking at what happens to this primary production, these plants, algae, phytoplankton, they're making a certain amount of chemical energy, using some of that themselves, and then what's left over can be passed on to things that eat phytoplankton, things that eat plants, and then those things get eaten, and then those things that eat the plants or the phytoplankton get eaten, and you have this transfer of energy between trophic levels, among trophic levels, from one trophic level higher and higher. And then this is the point that I was making, is that the amount of primary production in an ecosystem says a lot about that ecosystem in terms of how complex it is and how much biomass there is, how many different species there are, the different numbers of individuals for each species. So if primary production is so important in characterizing different ecosystems. And you can imagine that there's a lot of interest in measuring primary productivity. There's a lot of interest in understanding factors that influence primary productivity. So there's a number of different ways that you can measure primary production. So let's look at some of those different things. And you can also imagine, in terms of photosynthesis, these are some of the factors that we've looked at earlier in the semester. What kind of limits are there to photosynthesis, or what kind of limits are there to primary production? Obviously, if light energy is what starts this whole thing, light energy converted to chemical energy, light energy used to make ATP, and the ATP is used to make sugars, then light is obviously a big limiting factor. Temperature is limiting to a certain degree. A lot of temperature is related to the amount of solar energy, but temperature also influences these metabolic rates. So what you tend to find around the world is that in warm temperatures where the reaction rates are sped up, then you have higher levels of primary productivity. Where it's colder, then you have the rate of these enzymatic reactions slows down. You also tend to have less sunlight. But in warmer temperatures, you also have higher respiration rates. So it's not necessarily the very productive areas where it's warm, but there's also a lot of that energy that's produced in primary production is actually used by the plant. So it's not necessarily available for everybody else. And then part of that requirement for that equation that we saw for photosynthesis was that carbon dioxide is being used and water is being used. You all know if you don't water the plants, if you don't water the crops, they're going to die. Plants need water. So obviously water is a big limiting factor in terms of primary production. Places where there's a lot of water on Earth, there's high levels of primary production. And another limiting factor is nutrients. So let's look at some of these nutrients. We'll look at just nutrient cycling in terrestrial ecosystems and aquatic ecosystems. So in terrestrial ecosystems, there's nutrients that are acquired from the soil for the most part. And if you think about, again, going back to your biology days, you need a certain amount of nitrogen. Nitrogen is in every amino acid. Nitrogen is in every protein. Nitrogen is in every ATP. Nitrogen is in every RNA. Nitrogen is in every DNA. So nitrogen is very important. Phosphate is another important nutrient. Phosphate is in every ATP. That's what the P is. Phosphate is in every RNA and every DNA. So if you look at fertilizers, you go to the store and buy some fertilizers. You know what that fertilizer is? It's mostly nitrogen and phosphate. That's how important those two molecules are. In terms of aquatic production, same thing. There's how much nitrogen phosphate dissolve in water and how much you find in water is usually much less than you find in the soil. And that those nutrients in water are used up pretty quickly. And there's different levels of sources or abundance of nitrogen and phosphate in water. It's a very different set of conditions than in the soil. So where is the most primary production taking place? On land and in the water. Well, if you think about the limits in terms of water, sunlight, and nutrients, where do you find an abundance of water, sunlight, and nutrients on Earth? The places, the ecosystems where you're going to find the highest levels of primary productivity are going to be where there's a lot of sunlight, where it's warm, there's a lot of rainfall, and there's a lot of nutrients. Of course, that makes sense. Those are things that influence how much primary productivity there is. So keep that in mind. Where do you have a lot of sunlight? Where is it warm? Where do you have a lot of rainfall? And where do you have a lot of nutrients? If you're thinking about land and looking at those conditions, and maybe one of the first things that would come to mind is someplace like a tropical rainforest. Very productive, warm, a lot of sunlight near the equator, a lot of rainfall, a lot of nutrients. If you're thinking about aquatic ecosystems, you'd probably think coral, tropical, a lot of sunlight. You don't have to worry about rainfall because you're in the ocean, and a lot of nutrients. And there's other places on land as well, other places in the ocean or in aquatic systems that are highly productive. So let's look at these on land, and then we'll look in water. This terrestrial production, primary production, a lot of photosynthesis. Humid, so there's a lot of rainfall in the tropics, a lot of sunlight, warm. Where is it lowest? Where it's cold, there's not as much solar energy, not as many nutrients, certainly not as much water. Places like the tundra and the desert, those are low, humid tropics, high. In aquatic systems, freshwater, wetlands, where there's a lot of sun, it's shallow, so light isn't limiting, there's a lot of nutrients coming in from land. Places like marshes and swamps, very productive, very high levels of primary production. In marine systems, out in the open ocean, these nutrients are used up so quickly. The nutrients for replacing those that are used up are thousands of meters away down on the bottom. Not the best conditions for a lot of primary productivity. There's a lot of energy out there, but it's very spread out, very diffuse. In areas where there's upwelling, all these nutrients are brought up from the depths, replenishing all these nutrients. They're usually close to shore, shallow, so there's a lot of light. And some of these other areas where there's a lot of light, so they tend to be shallow. There's a lot of nutrients, so they tend to be shallow, sometimes with upwelling. And they tend to be close to shore, where all these nutrients are coming from. If you think about those types of ecosystems in the ocean, estuaries, very productive. Coral reefs, very productive. Kelp beds, very productive. Shallow, a lot of sunlight, a lot of nutrients. Water don't have to worry about water in the ocean. So the point that I made before is that the amount of primary productivity in these different ecosystems sets the stage for everything else there. That's how much energy there is available to a fox eventually, or to a coyote, or to an antelope, or to a frog. This is all set by the amount of primary production. So let's look at some terrestrial situations, some aquatic situations, in terms of if you express primary production as a per unit area and per unit time. So you notice this is net primary production. This is what's available for everybody else in grams per square meter per year. Now you might look at this in square kilometers, so it's some bigger scale, but it's a per unit area, per unit time. And if you look at terrestrial situations, swamps and marshes, now they're aquatic, but there's shallow water, so there's a lot of vegetation around there. Tropical rainforests, look at all the primary production there. That's a huge amount of carbon that's fixed, that in the form of sugar, that's available for everybody else. And then you go down this list, temperate forests, pretty productive, boreal forests, savanna, grassland, all the way down to these areas where there's not very much primary production. Tundra and alpine situations, deserts. Not very much water, not very much nutrients, not necessarily that much sunlight. Now out in the desert there might be a lot of sunlight, but there's not very much water. All those things affect primary production. So if you think about how diverse, how productive, how many different species and abundant, all these lush verdant places on Earth, and you compare a desert, not very diverse, not very much energy, not very lush, to a tropical rainforest, then you see the difference in terms of the primary production. In aquatic systems, algal beds is close to shore, reefs, very productive, estuaries, very productive, close to shore, a lot of nutrients, a lot of sunlight. And then you go out in the open ocean. The open ocean is a huge area, but in terms of the density of energy, grams per square meter per year, then it's pretty low. If you added it all up, it would be a huge amount of energy, but it's still very spread out. If you look at this in a different point of view, this is just not per unit area. This includes the per unit area. In the middle, this middle graph is similar to what we saw in the previous graph. But if you look at the percentage of the Earth's surface, the open ocean is a very large percentage of the Earth's surface. Continental shelves, pretty big percentage of the Earth's surface. If you look on land, it's a different situation where you've got deserts and these low productivity areas. If you look in the middle graph, now this is the primary production on a per unit area and per unit time basis. So then you see that these algal beds and reefs are very, very, very productive, 2,500 grams per square meter per year, compared to the open ocean, not very productive. And then again, you see tropical rainforests, how productive they are. Swamps and marshes, very productive. So on a per unit area basis and a per unit time basis, some of these places are very productive. But if you express those, or if you view those in terms of how much of the Earth's surface they actually represent, then some of these are pretty small. And if you add all this up in terms of how much primary production there is, this is what I was saying before. In the open ocean, it's a low rate of primary production, but the open ocean is so big that third figure all the way on the right, the total amount of primary production in the open ocean is huge. Even though if you're out there, it's scattered very diffusely. You're not going to find condensed areas of a lot of energy. On land, it's a different situation where the tropical rainforests, huge amount of primary production, and the area is relatively big, so they contribute a lot of the amount of primary production there is. And then you get into some other areas where the rate might not be that high, but the area is pretty big, so they're contributing some substantial amount of primary production. Savanna, boreal forests, and those kind of things. So you can see there's a difference between the rate of primary production and the total amount of primary production. You have some places where the rate is really high and it makes a huge contribution to total primary production. That's the case of tropical rainforests. You have some other places where the rate is not very high, but the area is just so expansive that it contributes a lot to the amount of primary production on Earth. So, if you remember this is a point talking about energy to reiterate here, is that energy flows through ecosystems. It goes from the sun to this plant. That plant is fed upon by this grasshopper. This grasshopper is eaten by a mouse. That mouse is eaten by something else. But these red arrows show what happens to the majority of this energy. It's lost. It's lost. It goes up into the atmosphere. It goes up into the universe. It's lost forever. Now, the next thing that we're going to turn our attention to are these blue arrows. That's things like carbon, nitrogen, phosphate. It goes from the plant to the grasshopper to the mouse. That mouse dies, and then that energy is transferred from the mouse, dead mouse, to these decomposers, to the soil, back to the plant. Around and around it goes. That's what we're going to see when we look at this next topic on Friday. which is the cycling of nutrients and elements. And that's going to take a considerable amount of time to go through. But it's going to be cycles in living things and that move between living things and non-living things and then back into living things. So that's what we have to look forward to for our lecture on Friday.